Al-Farabi and the Soul. Al-Farabi, a proeminent medieval Islamic philosophy, made a remarkable synthesis between Greek philosophy and Islamic tradition. He based many of his conception on Aristotle's work, particularly in his psychology, concept of the soul, definition and nature. Al-Farabi defined the soul as an immated substance independent of the body, but it is not merely the vitality of the body but the essence that gives it and capacity for understanding. Faculties of the soul. He divided the soul into different faculties. Nutritive, responsible for basic functions of growth and nutrients. Sensitive, related to perception and senses. Imaginative, capable of creating images and concept from sensory perceptons. Rational, divided into two parts. The capacity to learn and acquire knowledge. The capacity to understand and reason. Objective of the soul. For Al-Farabi, the ultimate goal of the rational soul is to achieve perfection, thorough knowledge, intellectual contemplation and moral practice. The nature of intellect in Al-Farabi, a comprehensive analysis. The active intellect in human perfection. Al-Farabi's conception of intellect, especially the notion of a universal active intellect, reveal a profound quest for intellectual perfection. This activity intellect, as a kind of cosmic mold, provides the forms and principles that organize human knowledge. By connecting with this intellect, the human individual approaches intellectual perfection, which is the ultimate goal of philosophy. The influence of Plato and Aristotle on Al-Farabi's philosophy. Al-Farabi, one of the greatest medieval Islamic philosophers, built this philosophy on a solid foundation formed by the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. The work of these two classical Greek philosophers served as starting point for reflection on the soul, intellect, and the nature of reality. The Platonic heritage. On the world of ideas, Al-Farabi, like Plato, believed in the existence of world of ideas, an immutable and perfect realm where the pure eternal forms of things reside. These forms are the models from which all things in the sensible world are molded. The soul as divine participant. The soul, for Al-Farabi, is spark of the divine, capable of connecting with the world of ideas. This Platonic conception of the soul as something immortal and divine deeply influenced his philosophy. The importance of knowledge. Following Plato, Al-Farabi valued intellectual knowledge as the path to truth and happiness. Philosophy for him was the active pursuit of these perfect ideas.
The Aristotelian heritage. The soul as the form of the body. Al-Farabi adopted Aristotle's view of the gives life and organization to a living being. For Aristotle, the soul is the active principle that animates matter. On the importance of logic. Aristotelian logic, with its rules of reasoning, was fundamental for Al-Farabi in his pursuit of truth. He used logic to analyze and systematize his ideas. Al-Farabi followed Aristotle in classification of science, distinguishing between theoretical science such as mathematics, physics, and metaphysis, and practical science such as ethics and politics. Al-Farabi did not simply copy the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, but synthesized them in an original way, creating his own philosophical system. He reconciled the Platonic view of the soul as divine particle with the Aristotelian view of the soul as the form of the body. In addition, he incorporated elements of Neoplatonism, sch as the idea of transcendent one, the source of all reality. Al-Farabi's philosophy represents a rch synthesis of Greek and Islamic philosophy traditions. The influence of Plato and Aristotle is evident in his conception of the soul, intellect, and nature of reality. The most detailed study of Al-Farabi on the intellect can be found most appropriately in the Epistle on the Intellect. He begins by showing the various contexts in which the nominal and verbal forms of the intellect and intelligence are employed in Aristotle. He points out that Aristotle uses the term in his logical, ethical, psychological, and metaphysical treatises. In each area, it is the intellect that is responsible for understanding the first principles, or premises of the subject, and for allowing a person to perfect their knowledge of it. For Al-Farabi, this seemingly innocuous statement should serve to praise Aristotle's epistemic methodology over the denaturalized. Well guys, if you got this far, don't forget to comment on the content and subscribe to the channel. Share, tell us what you think. On the share, tell us what you think on the brief description of the subject. And active the bell.
The nature of active intellect in Al-Farabi. A delicate question. The exact nature of the active intellect in Al-Farabi is a complex issue that has been the subject of various debates among scholars. The answer is not simple and straightforward, as it involves a definitive and exhaustive definition of the active intellect. His writings suggest that the conceived of this entity as kind of intermediary between the divine world and the sensible world. However, the exact nature of this intermediation remains open to interpretation. Arguments in favor the separation. The active intellect is an active principle. Some interpret the active intellect as a distinct active principle from good, responsible for giving form and order to the universe. In this perspective, the active intellect would be divine emanation but not the divinity itself. The need for an intermediary between good and the sensible world can be seen as a way to avoid the pantheistic identification of good with the world. Arguments in favor of the identification with the divinity. RHE active intellect is the divine mind. Others argue that active intellect is, in fact, the divine mind itself, which manifests in the world to give it order and intelligibility. In this perspective, the unity of being. Al-Farabi, like many other Islamic philosophers, emphasizes the unity of being. This leads to the conclusion that all things, including the active intellect, are manifestation of a single divine principle. Equality between the sexes and intellect in Al-Farabi. Deeper analysis. Al-Farabi's ascension of intellectual equality between men and women, though revolutionary for his time, deserves a more profound analysis. The thesis of intellectual equality. Al-Farabi grounds this thesis in Plato's view contrast with Aristotelian and medieval conceptions that often subordinated women to men. Implications. If men and women possess the same cognitive abilities, the both can attain intellectual perfection, including philosophy and prophecy. Limitations of equality. Despite this radical statement, Al-Farabi did not develop a complete theory of gender equality. Cultural and religious context. Medieval Islamic society, like many other, was deeply patriarchal. Although theoretically defending intellectual equality between the sexes, manifests in practice. What would be the social, political, and religious implications of this equality? The role of the active intellect. The concept of the active intellect plays a crucial role in Al-Farabi's theory of knowledge and human perfection. Source of intelligible forms. The active intellect is the source of all intelligible forms. Universal ideas yacht structure are though. Engine of knowledge. It acts as an engine that moves the potential intellect, transforming it into actual intellect. Guarantor of equality. By being a universal and impartial sources, the active intellect ensure that all human beings, regardless of sex, have access to the same intelligible forms and therefore, can achieve the same intellectual perfection. Al-Farabi's theory intellectual equality between men and women is significant advancement for his time, but it also has limitations. Although he defends equality in principle, the lack of a more detailed elaboration and the influence of the cultural and religious context of his time prevent a more practical and widespread application of his ideas. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching content.